Let me turn to Leni, who has recently done quite a lot of work looking at how local government structures work and deliver and how they engage with citizens, to see if she's got some reflections to Biju's grand overview.
Great, thank you. Well, congratulations, Biju. I think this is a really important piece of work and one of the sort of most in-depth treatments of this issue that we've had in recent years. So I think you're to be congratulated, as is your co-author. And I think it speaks to a very strong policy interest, as you touched on, for the World Bank, but also for DFID, for a whole range of other bilateral donors at the moment in participatory development. So it's an important time for us to be having this discussion. I also think, and you've sort of put this head on already in your presentation, it raises some uncomfortable truths for us in thinking about these issues. We may be all in line with the kind of principles behind participatory development approaches, but I think this work shows us that the reality is that there can be failures on the side of civil society and communities too. And I think, this is a very important message. It's not a new message. There's a long history of work from political economy that showed the kinds of failures that you can have on the side of communities and civil society, as well as the market and government. And I think this is another contribution to that very much sort of speaks to what the broader literature tells us in those areas. But I just wanted to add a couple of reflections really from my own research experience, where I think I've seen some of the things that you're describing play out on the ground. And perhaps I'll leave it to David to pick up on those broader trends in the literature. So one of the really interesting questions I think this work raises is that question, okay, well, does decentralization always deliver in terms of better policies for poor people? And I think, there's a very strong assumption often that democratic decentralization will make government more responsive to local people, that it will be something of a corrective if the state is seen as corrupt or as weak or as unresponsive to its citizens, then you can decentralize to address that. And I think the international community often pushes for decentralization at point of transition or change in countries, reflecting that. But those outcomes aren't always achieved. And I've seen that in my work in Malawi, who I think its experience of decentralization is pretty instructive here. So there's some recent work that we've published, led by colleagues of Manaid ODI, Dana Kamek and Tam O'Neill. It's on our website now, which I've been involved in, looking at local governance, decentralization and service delivery in a number of sectors. And what it describes is how decentralization has been rolled out. So what you see is decentralization is introduced, heavily influenced by donor support in the sort of mid to late 90s following the introduction of multi-party democracy. Very quickly, however, political decentralization stalls. So local councils are suspended periodically. In fact, this year they've been elected a few weeks ago for the first time in about a decade. But you don't really have that political decentralization. You have some forms of administrative and fiscal decentralization, but rolled out in very ad hoc, uncoordinated ways. And essentially what you get is a process that's characterized by the formal and informal re-centralization of power in different sectors, very informal decision-making, a lot of political interference at different points, and a fairly chaotic system without much coordination across it. And whereas decentralization was sort of pushed for because it was seen as a way of addressing quite clientelistic, patronage-based politics at the center, what it did was it decentralized those dynamics. So it pushed them down rather than acting to change them or stop them. And I think, what this sort of reinforces for me is the need to question that assumption about what decentralization can do. That we need to look much more closely at how decentralization is implemented, the nature and the form that it takes. We need to look at that wider enabling environment, and crucially, and Biju's touched on this, whether there is a strong state or a strong political backing for this project. Because if there isn't, and if it's seen as a way of actually kind of curtailing elites, powerful elites at the center, you're going to get very mixed results. I also just wanted to offer a few quick reflections on some of the themes around sort of collective action that Biju raised for us, where I think, again, a key finding that he points us to is the need to recognize this sort of civil society failure. and to think about how you correct for it, but also how you build genuinely collective action that brings together supply and demand sides, if you like. And the notion of this sandwich that he's talked about, I think, has been striking in some of my work, looking at things like community scorecard programs. A bit different to some of the community-driven development that you were talking about, but I think there's some parallels as well. So at the moment I'm doing some work that's looked at how those kinds of programs have played out in Malawi, but also comparatively with Ethiopia, Rwanda, Tanzania, so some quite different governance contexts. And I think, again, what comes through quite strongly from that is that, perhaps unsurprisingly, given what we now know, results really emerge when they genuinely encourage communities to come together with local service providers, with district officials, with others who are important in those communities, whether it's traditional chiefs or faith leaders or others, but to genuinely solve problems together and identify what they can all do to help address a particular gap or blockage around services. So you can get positive results around how resources get allocated, around infrastructure, around also solving information gaps or building trust between different groups. But it really requires sort of genuine collective working, and that requires really good facilitation, very skillful, locally aware facilitation to get right. It can be induced, sometimes by third parties, by those who are outside of those processes, by those from NGOs, funded by donor agencies, but it has to be very locally embedded and sort of politically smart. And I think the other thing that's come through, and I think what's interesting is, whereas I think we are having some of this questioning now around community participation, citizen participation, we're starting to ask questions about what's in it for citizens. What our work on community scorecards shows is we also have to ask, well, what's in it on the other side for service providers, for officials to take part in these programs? And we don't tend to look at that. And what we've found from looking at some of this scorecard work is that actually, if you do this kind of participatory approaches well, they can also be very empowering for frontline service providers. They can actually allow them some information, some visibility, some leverage upwards within a ministry to district officials, central level, which otherwise they don't have. So these kinds of projects, are not only about the citizen and how they participate, but also who else participates with them, and how we make that meaningful for everyone, I think, is an important point. So I think this work opens up some really important sort of policy questions and dilemmas for us. Perhaps a couple of quick questions just to leave us with, which maybe you can come back to. One is you tend to talk very generally about sort of community and citizen participation and to put together lots of different things, decentralisation, community-driven development of different models and modalities. And I wonder if you think it's helpful sometimes to disaggregate those, to think a bit about whether some models work better than others, some modalities work better. Does this work better in some sectors? You talked a bit about that, but perhaps we could say more, because I think even between health and education, there are different challenges that citizens face around information asymmetries, around how they interact with the service, whether it's education versus healthcare, which they only worry about when they're ill, and so on. So do we need to disaggregate further to really get a fuller picture about what works and where? And the second, I think the real test for this work is around how do we really change some of those incentives, those programming models, that monitoring culture that you talked about. It feels like we have been talking about this for some time. We know these challenges are there. This is, I think, one of the best and most in-depth pieces I've seen done on the World Bank's work specifically. But I know the World Bank has also recently committed to sort of include citizen engagement in all of its projects going forwards. So is that a positive from your perspective, or does that imply challenges in terms of how we actually bring in the lessons from this work to that agenda?
Great. Thank you, Leni. Just before I hand over to David, Leni mentioned this work on Malawi. If you want to find out more, and if you want to find out how all this plays out in relation to recent elections that Leni mentioned, we're going to discuss that in some depth in a couple of days' time on the 12th. So come back in person or online to hear more about that, and we will have the authors of the report back here. David, over to you.